The reason why I ask you guys about this is because the information that we go over today has a direct relationship to your online games. And I'm specific in saying if you're playing a PlayStation or an Xbox or anything like that that is self-contained, that's one thing. But when you go online and start playing other people, this is where this information becomes relevant. Now, how many of you guys have been playing a game online and all of a sudden the ping rate just goes right through the roof and you're going, ah, or you're in a really good battle, you're winning, and then that ping rate hits and you end up dying? Well, guess what? Welcome to the multiplexing scenarios that we have for you today. So we're going to be working off of identify basic facts about timing and synchronization standards. Remember, you have to get 70% on the block test. What does that mean? There are 40 questions. You have to get 28 of them correct in order to pass. This is one of the most difficult blocks that are in the course, and my job is to get you through this to where you understand the material. It's easier if you understand it versus I'm just memorizing it. So I'm going to be coming with some explanations. Others I'm going to just lightly touch. So if you can get a feel for what I'm doing, it should help you out. So let's take a look at this. As you well know, we always come up with an AFSC application. You're going to be dealing with time. Now we're going to go through this and explain why time is relevant with our multiplexing system. We're going to look at purpose of timing, timing standards, timing sources, time coordination, distribution agencies, timing jitter, and network synchronization. So before I start with anything else, just going to lay down some what I call respect rules. So when we have a class, make sure that you're here. I would prefer that you're here just a little bit early because I like to start on time instead of waiting for people to log on. If you have a problem logging on and you're doing it before the time is for class, you have enough time to go down and say, hey, I'm having problems logging on, and nothing will be said. But if you're going to be late, I got to start questioning it. Next part of that is homework and appraisals. I ask that you have the integrity to do them, but if anybody has ever seen the Netflix series The Witcher, I like to pull a law of surprise on you. So watch out, make sure that you're doing your homework. So enough said, let's go on with the lesson. We're going to be looking at the purpose of timing. Why do we have it? Well, when you guys heard me say about the ping rate, that has everything to do with the timing. In other words, something happened, there was a glitch in the system, and everything has to resync itself to get back on time. And that's the reason why we die, or, you know, in my world of tanks, I like to play, and on occasion I've had where the ping rate goes completely through the roof, especially when you're trying to turn around a corner where there's a river right next to you, and the next thing you know, you're in the river because the ping rate went through the roof. So with multi-channel communication networks, the bottom line for this is everybody needs to have timing. Just like your game's going to need to have timing when you're playing out in the multiplayer games. Now, this particular scenario, you'll see in the center of this picture is a multiplexer. This multiplexer was in the course probably about 10 years ago, and it is a fantastic device to learn from and how multiplexers work. This is an FCC 100, and you can see that we have multiple channels and multiple users on the multiplexer. Now, from the top down, you got a NIPRNet, a switchboard, you got a SIPRNet, excuse me, and then off to the bottom right-hand side, you see phones and computers. Now, There's a big difference between users and channels. This particular multiplexer has 16 channels, but it can have multiple users. Now, some of these users are single entities versus multiple entities. And I give you the SIPRnet. Look how many people are on the SIPRnet compared to one of the computers. So one of the computers can be a channel by itself. So user and channel are interchangeable. However, users on the SIPRnet go into one channel. You can see that we take all of this, we make it into an aggregate, slip it out, and send it to the antenna to send to the distant end. So that is an example of how we use timing with the multiplexer to send out. You're going to see, I want to say in the next couple days with the NSM, the precursor to the satellite. In room 116 is where the NSM 50 is. When you get to rooms 118 and 120, that's where the satellite is. And you're going to still be using the NSM. So all this plays into what you're going to be seeing in the next couple blocks. We're going to look at time standards. We have apparent time, mean time, atomic time, coordinated universal time, and my favorite, hammer time. You know, dun, 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 dun. No? No? Bad? Okay, never mind. Apparent solar time is the earliest form. This is a sundial. It's the least accurate. When we look at mean solar time, this is where they started doing with the inventions of things like watches, you know, not wrist watches yet, but clocks like a pocket watch, Big Ben in England, and I refer to that often. If you get a chance, watch the history on Big Ben. Talks a lot about what we are going to be looking at. This is where universal time started. We clock it through Greenwich Mean Time. If anybody has orders to England, I highly recommend that you go through and try to see Greenwich, England. They do have tours that goes through the beginning of time, so to speak. Universal time is also equivalent to GMT, which is Greenwich Mean Time. So they're using the mean solar time as a way to do this. This is where they started figuring out the Earth's rotation, the orbit, the changes of the seasons, and so forth and so on. So they're able to get more accurate time for this. When we look at atomic time, it's a little bit different. This is when we're starting to use higher technology in order to keep time. Now, you got to look at mechanical versus quartz versus atomic. So there's a phase of how everything went through. So the idea here is we are using now the atomic time as the world standard. GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, is the world standard. Also, UTC is the world standard. And of course, it goes through how we work things from the beginning to the end. So when we look at this next one, UTC, you're going, wait a minute, that's Coordinated Universal Time. That is not UTC, it's CUT. Well, au contraire there. UTC is Universal Coordinated something other time, and it's all French. So you can see why the UTC we classified it, because the French are now the ones where we keep our timing standard. So GMT transferred to the universal time. The TIA is the international agency that keeps it, and we're going to go through it here in just a minute. This changed in 1972 so we can make sure that we have a standard for the whole world. So atomic time is where we get our reference from, but we always classify or refer to UTC time as where everything is based off of. There are 24 different time zones. I'm going to take you to this timeanddate.com. So if you get a chance, go look it out. They have a wealth of information there. but I'm going to show you the time mat here in just a minute. We also classify what I call the prime meridian, which is latitude up and down, zero line. It is UTC, you got zero meridian, GMT, a lot of different names, but for the military we always classified it Zulu because we reference all of our missions through Zulu time. We look at the local time and convert it over to the Zulu time. So all of our missions start with Zulu. So you have to figure out, okay, if it says I got to be at 12 o'clock Zulu, 1200 Zulu, and it's 3 o'clock my time, I need to adjust. Here is the time map I pulled off of the website, and just goes to show you, and I hope everybody can see it. Anybody not having anybody having problems viewing this, please let me know. No? Maybe? Okay. So it's pretty clear, because I mean, on my end it's clear as a bell, but on your end's a different story. So with this particular map, you can find this on, that timeanddate.com. This is the legend that they use. You can see that if you were to look at that line over where England and France and all those, that is UTC time. That is 0 hour. And you can look through all the different color charts on it, and you can see that when you get to the United States, our Eastern time is 4 hours away from UTC. In other words, we'd have to minus it. Central time is 5 hours, 6 hours for, I think it's Mountain time, 7 hours for Pacific, and of course we have Alaskan, excuse me, and so forth and so on. Now, you'll also see that there's some differences on this map where it doesn't like to use the UTC, but it does. If you look at India or Australia, you'll notice that there are some diagonal lines in there. Those are half hours. So if you look at the legend, of course I don't have the complete excuse me, site up for you because it just won't fit. But the way they look at those is it's half hours, so about halfway through the area they'll switch it to the half hour. But there are other countries that use only one standard time. Look at China. They cover approximately 5 different time zones, but they have one. And that's just to keep the country on board. But again, everything is referenced through UTC. We have timing sources, and let me try to explain this particular paragraph for you. I have 9:24 a.m. on my computer, and I tell you, okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break at 9:24, be back at 9:29. Well, you're going to have to set your clock to my clock. What does that mean? It means my clock is the primary source, your clock is the secondary source. So that's the way UTC works, is everybody references UTC as the primary source, and the secondary source is where they're at. So that'll give you an idea how this works. We do have timing sources such as oscillators. We have quartz oscillators and atomic oscillators. Quartz uses something called the piezoelectric effect in order to generate a frequency, and then we have 2 problems with it: temperature and aging. Temperature, we can control it, but not the aging. It's just like this old fart right here. I get old. You're going to get old too, just like me one of these days. Survive, please. I'd like to see 80. Anyway, just when you look at quartz oscillator, they're not the most accurate. When you get the atomic oscillators, they become highly accurate. We talked about 2 different kinds, which are rubidium and cesium. The rubidium is the least accurate of the atomic quartz, but I have come across this in a couple of 206 palettes. And what do we use them in those palettes for? Well, there's 4 different radios, and they do some frequency hopping. And if you can remember back in block 3, Remember the prick 113 and your frequency hopping? What did you have to use? Everybody had to be on the same time hack, didn't they? Well, with the rubidium oscillator, before you go out, everybody makes sure that you're on time before you go out. So when you go in that Humvee where the 206 pallet is, again, 4 different radios, and you're doing frequency hopping, that rubidium is about as accurate as you could get it, and everybody else has a rubidium, you're going to be on time and be able to talk to everybody with the frequency hopping. When we look at the cesium, it's more accurate. So the differences between cesium and rubidium you can see just by looking at the stability and the clocks and how it looks. And you don't really need to remember that. You just need to know that cesium is more accurate than rubidium. Why? Because rubidium is when everything started. We got some up in the GPS satellites, and then we started going to the cesium and so forth and so on. You know, we have a mix of older satellites versus newer satellites with the GPS system. You know, law of attrition in that case. We have time coordination distribution agencies. Now, what happened with this is everybody got together and said, hey, this is how many seconds or time events in a day. So now we're going to keep time and we're going to make it as accurate as we can. The idea is we're going to keep it for the whole world to where everybody knows that, hey, it's this time in UTC, but this is our time at this point. There are the distribution agency called BIPM, USNO, and NIST. Let's take a look at each one of them. The BIPM, you'll notice that International Bureau of Weights and Measures, again, it doesn't match the name. However, when you're French, they turn words around. You kind of understand them, but you don't. It is based out of Paris, France. It maintains UTC. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's where you get your time from and distribute it to other agencies. Now, they not only did time, but they are the world's holder of measurements like what is a kilogram, what's a pound, how far is a mile, how long is an inch, you know, so forth and so on. They are the keeper of everything. And believe it or not, if you need something really accurate, you're going to send it to BIPM and they're going to calibrate it and they'll send it back to you. It's mainly for the scientific community, not us. So we don't need to send our tape measures over to them and say, hey, is this right or is this wrong? So you get the idea. The organization here, the link is at the bottom. You can look at this later. I do record these for you. So that way if you want to, let's say, go through a part of this lecture again, you can go and look at the video and, okay, I want that part. I do this because I see a lot of people online, you know, they'll ask me questions and the video seems to help out. I noticed that there are a lot of classes I only see like 4 or 5 people will look at them, and then I see a whole class look at them. So it just depends on what was said during the day. I'll give you the link on this as soon as I can get it up and operational. You guys do know that we have a RF transmission YouTube channel for this. No? Maybe? Oh. Okay, good. Yeah. I try to get everybody from the instructor side, but most of them do not have the capabilities of recording. I keep telling them, hey, I got some free time, and they won't be doing the, their class until later, which I'm doing a class. So our timing is off right now. One of these days, we'll be able to get everybody on board. This is what BIPM looks like. In the top left-hand side, you can see BIPM as opposed to the way we classify it. The agencies on the area top, you can see at the top where the tabs are, and on the right, you can see what in this case, World Meteorology Day. And this just gives you an idea of what's on the website. It is a little difficult to get through, so if you just want to take a wild gander, they do have the English version. That's what's up here. Next up, we have the USNO. This one, you'll see that I have a phone number for it. And if you dial that phone number up, you'll get not only UTC, but you'll get Eastern Standard Time. Just a gee whiz thing for you guys. It does control the timing for DOD. This is what we use. So we get the time from BIPM, and we as the United States military uses USNO for our time. The number is headquarters. Where they base the time out of is actually down in Pensacola. Let's take a look at the website. There you go. In this case, I got Friday over on the right hand side. You can see Friday the 5th of June. It says 21:39:36. That is the master clock for DOD. There's also an area in there that will show how much of a delay it is from getting the time from BIPM to the United States. Normally it's in milliseconds. Pretty ingenious, but they do have some history on that, so I encourage you to take a look at it. Then we have NIST. This is the civilian side of the house. So you have the military side and then the civilian. Why is it important to us? Well, if you take a look down in the middle part of this slide, you'll see WWV, WWVH, WWVB. Those are three agencies. WWV is the headquarters in Maryland. WWVH is Hawaii. WWVB is Boulder, Colorado. Now this has some history to it. It was made somewhere in the early 40s, if I can remember. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the 40s. And they used the time so everybody could make sure that, hey, at this particular time we got to start doing our blackout of the lights in order for, you know, the coastal cities to where we would use blackout lights. So they used this time to make sure everybody else was on time. And that's the reason why it was developed. WWVB is where everything was at. It wasn't until the mid-40s when Hawaii came on board. Again, I gave you a phone number. You can use this to, research or just listen to it. It gives a time about every 30 seconds. Now, why is it important for us, for the military, to understand VH and VB? Well, ladies and gentlemen, they have time hacks over the air in the HF realm. So 2.5, 5, 10, 15, and 20, they're constantly broadcasting this. So if you're overseas and you want to know what UTC time is, if you can pull up one of those channels, you might be able to hear it. There's been some unusual occasions where I can hear Hawaii first and then Boulder, Colorado right after it. And you're going, well, how's that possible? How do you know which one's Hawaii, which one's Boulder, Colorado? Believe it or not, history again, Hawaii, female voice. Boulder, Colorado, male voice. Look it up. It's pretty ingenious on this particular website. Has a lot of history on there. So you can go through it. I think it's under the topics tab here. Next up, this is something near and dear to you guys' heart when you're playing an online game. It's called timing jitter. This is where ping rates have some issues. The big thing is what is timing jitter? And that's when you got a shift where everything goes out of sync. So timing jitter, you got two different types. You got short term and long term. Let's take a look at these. Short term, the easiest way to describe that is when you get on, let's just say YouTube, or even, and I've noticed that Netflix does it too. When you select it, the first thing you see is that nice little circle, and then the video will play. And that's so it can buffer. And what is buffering? Well, it's that delay that they want to get enough information stored so they can play the video with the audio where it's not out of sync and be able to play it all the way through without having problems. Now, how does it do it? Well, they have something called an elastic store. In our case, we call it a buffer. The idea is I'm going to put information in there so if I do have a glitch, then I'm not having to worry. Can't do it in gains because there's too much reactive issues with it. Our gains would be you get ready to, and I'm just saying it from a tank perspective, I'm getting ready to shoot it. I click the fire button and nothing happens because I just got stalled. You know, ping rate goes through the roof and voila, I end up dead. Long-term jitter, this is where the servers come into play. And the idea behind it is you're always going to have this because of something called unsynchronized clocks. They're highly stable, but the time it takes to go from one server to another might be an issue. If you're someone who likes to play a little bit different on occasion, i.e. like I will play the South American server when I feel like that I'm having a bad day on the North American server, the ping rate will go up. Why? It takes a long time to go to South America and back. Or even go crazier and go to the European server or the Asian server. The ping rate really goes through the roof. You can still play it, but your reactionary time is delayed a little bit. How does it get all this synced up? Well, you guys have used it before. It's called phase lock loop. You use this to keep your radios on frequency. In our case, we use phase lock loop to keep our frequency or our clocks on time. There are 4 different types of network synchronization. We have Isochronous, mutual, master clock, and master slave. Let's take a look at each one of them. You got Isochronous. I like to call it the dinosaur. It's easier to remember. This one says that each node produces its own clock and it averages it by using the elastic store. The easiest way to describe this particular thing is you guys probably have LAN parties over there on occasion where you'll hook up a bunch of computers together and play your game. There you go. That's a Isochronous. The next one's called mutual. This one has several nodes in it, and the idea is you're averaging clocks back and forth. This one is where you really have a super big LAN party. Now, if somebody gets tired, you can pull the plug and leave, and of course all the computers will sync back up. Next up, we have something called master clock. Now, this one does have some history to it. I like to refer to Big Ben with it. Big Ben is a master clock back in the earlier years, and the reason why it was a master clock is that particular device, when it would ring its chimes, you could hear it through the countryside, and everybody would pull out their pocket watches, look at their watch to see if their watch was on time. So it was a master clock. But the problem is, if it ever went down, no one really knew what time it was. So you didn't know if you had to be on work if you were going to work and you were on time. So the big thing here is, and I give you this example back when I was going through high school. Yeah, it was a pretty long time ago. Anyway, we had a master clock. It failed, and they had to get on the intercom to let us know when to change classes and when to start classes. This is done that way for about 2 weeks before they finally got it fixed. But you can see, if the master clock fails, everything fails. Master slave is how we get these clocks to where if something goes wrong with it, we got to back up. we have a backup to the backup. For example, in the Air Force, we have several bases that there's a primary and an alternate, depending on what base. I think it's Barksdale and Offutt are the bases in the middle. Those are the two primary. So the object is we get most of our information, you know, let's just say one of them gets blown up, the other one becomes, you know, the main primary. But in our sense, where we get a lot of our timing on the computers, we get it from Randolph. If Randolph gets blown up, I think, who's the other one? I think Hill Air Force Base is the backup. It's been a while since I've seen the architecture for something like the master slave. It has changed over time. So it just gives you an idea that how timing is really important to everybody. So it actually governs our day-to-day life, especially if you have computers or a phone, because you're constantly pulling the time off of it. So we've gone through purpose of timing, timing standards, timing sources, time coordination, distribution agencies, timing jitter, network synchronization. Are there any questions at this time? Questions, questions, questions. No? Maybe? So Airman Schaefer, you there? Okay, so what does a quartz use to keep time? In other words, how does it generate a timing sequence? No idea? Okay. Yeah, Discord on occasion. This is about the time frame where everything starts cutting out. When we are using a quartz oscillator, what is, or how does it generate its time? Right? Right? And what is that called? Bingo. That's what I was looking for. Excuse me. Oh, man. So, Mercer, what is the agency that we use to keep all of our time? It's international. Mm-hmm. Rodriguez, who is the keeper of DoD time? Us know? Yeah. You would be correct. You would be correct. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next set here. We're going to be looking at, let me back this up here. 1 Bravo, identify basic relationship, or excuse me, the identify relationship of basic facts, state general principles associated with principles, capabilities, limitations of multiplexers. Again, 70%. You guys know the drill, right? We look at the AFSC application. You're going to be playing with a multiplexer called an NSM 50. We're going to look at general multiplexing terms, input data relationships, types of multiplexing, modes of TDM, demultiplexing, signaling formats, and analog to digital conversion. What a mouthful. So here are your terms. You have analog and digital. Everybody's pretty much aware of it. I like to give, pick one. I like to start with analog just to give ourselves an idea how to decipher or define it. It says analog, an infinite number of values constantly changing amplitude. So that's true. Well, digital is normally the opposite, right? It's a limited number. So if you take those couple words and look at it, if you know one, the other is the opposite. In other words, analog, infinite, unlimited. And another word, indiscrete, which means the same as the other two. So if it's digital, then the names become reversed, like limited, finite, and discrete. So those are three terms that you can associate with it, or definitions. Then we have bit. You guys should know about this from block 6. Not to be confused with byte, because we are going to talk about bytes later. And we have the definition of multiplexing, or multiplexer. This is a combination of a couple channels or more into a single or aggregate signal. In other words, we're going to take and use time and send it out as one signal. Could be many users. So this is an idea about how a multiplexer works. So you have channel 1, 2, and 3, and you can see the output where we have diagonal bars, solid bars, and horizontal bars. And each one of them is going through a sequential 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. As it forms it, it sends it out. That's your aggregate. That's the data flows they talk about. Next up, we have something called sampling, not to be confused with the buffet. I wish they were back yet. I mean, good grief. Anyway, sampling, this is where we are going to take in sequence, because you don't want to hop around on an analog waveform. We're going to take in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we're going to look at the amplitude of each, and each one of them is going to be very finite in their selection. Otherwise, they're going to be equal distance for each of those samples. We have something called a frame. This is a sample from each channel, and the idea here is we got to identify where these go. So when it gets to the distant end, this is how we keep time. And the distant end will say, okay, this goes in a channel 1 slot, this goes in a channel 2 slot, and so forth and so on, depending on how many channels you have for the multiplexer. We have something called non-informational bits. This is, I'm not sure if you got the word overhead in block 6. Did you get that word? No? Okay. What overhead is not part of the information. Okay? What's information? The information is the actual word. For example, we always relate it to an 8-bit word. Well, anything outside of that 8-bit word, in other words, how do I tell it where to go, what channel it is, when to begin it, when to stop it, when do I need to stuff it because I don't have all the information in there. So the frame bit, the start, stop bit, and stuffing bits are called non-information bits, and we also classify them as overhead. Overhead means it's additional information that's being sent down to the distant end in order for things to work properly. Bandwidth. This one has a couple different definitions to it. It can be a rate, a speed, a range of frequencies. So, 56K, yeah, that's archaic, but hey, it's out there. 300 to 3 gig, these are all examples of bandwidth. We have something called asynchronous. So you're going to hear async, sync, and ISO. Async is the first one. This is taking 8 bits and sending it out. You can use a keyboard or mouse for an example. You also have framing that goes along with it. There are stop and start bits. There's more to it, but we're just giving a general feel for how an 8-bit word under the word synchronous falls into place. So in other words, we have a lot of information that goes with that 8-bit word. We have synchronous. Now this one says it's like a train. You come up with boxcar 1, it opens, you put the information in. Here comes boxcar number 2. There's no information, but it still opens up, and it takes X amount of time if you had the information to put it in there, and then it will close and go on to number 3 and number 4 and number 5 like that. The problem with this one is it's always fixed. This is the time it's going to come by. This is the time you have to put information in it. Isochronous is a combination of being async at a synchronous rate. Async because you got start and start bits. Async because you have framing bits. Synchronous because here is the time that you're going to be able to put it in there. The problem with that is you're going to, if you don't have any time, and here comes your boxcar, or any information, excuse me, when your train comes in, everything went into boxcar number 1. But boxcar number 1's got to be pretty big now, because now you're adding all the information, like stop and start bit, as opposed to synchronous, which you didn't need that. It just had the particular time. So stop and start bit. So if you have another boxcar and it's supposed to have information in it, but there is no information, you got to stuff it. And that's to keep everything on time. Isochronous is what I classify as the old style of having video where it's constantly playing. And an idea would be the old systems of the what I call VIDs, which is a visual intrusion device system on the WSAs that we have in the Air Force. And what it is a combination of cameras and alarms with it. And it's constantly doing this. So everything has to be on time and everything has to be synced up. So ISO, I can see why it was used for that. We're getting away from that. I don't see it being used anymore, but we still have older equipment out there in the Air Force. Remember, we have to take care of the taxpayers' money, so you might actually see that. Frequency division multiplexing. This one is talking about frequency. This is the old style of cell phones back in the day, when cell phones are starting to become very, useful device. But your problems is when you went from one cell site to another. Let's look at it. Okay, user A has from 82 to 83. User B has 83.1 to 84. User C has 84.1 to 85. Well, let's just say that you're in that particular cell site area and you get user 1. Okay, you have from 82 to 83. And you can get through the central office because, the cell site takes that RF, converts it into information, and then sends it through the multiplexer. Well, when you go from one cell site to the other and user A is not available, sometimes your phone will switch to an unused channel, but other times it wouldn't. So you had a lot of dropped calls with this particular type. It worked, but you didn't really have a whole lot of capabilities with it. When you went to TDM, that's when things became a little bit more, or I should say less challenging for drop calls. So this one is assigning specific time slots and how you do things. Well, with TDM, we have something that calls a basic TDM multiplexer interleaves. In other words, he mixes them in there to where when you send it to the distant end, you're not going to lose all the data. It's also the newest form, TDMA is what they call it, where your phone will select a channel, get on that channel, but when you get to the next cell site, if that channel's not available, it switches you over very quick. It's unusual now to get drop calls. I say unusual. It still happens, but you get it on occasion. Modes of TDM, we have sync and async. Let's take a look at them. This is when we assign this is sync now, assign time slots to our channels, whether they're active or inactive. And again, I use the old train idea of it's got, in our case, 24 boxcars. Every boxcar will open and will stay on the depot there for anybody to get off and get on. But once the time is exceeded, and it closes the doors and goes to the next one. Well, if there's nobody to get on or get off, it's just wasted time, ain't it? And this shows you an example of what happens when you don't have all of your data. You still have the time frame that it's going to be there. You're just not going to be using it. And this is the fallacy of synchronous. Now, it is useful. This is what all the newer cameras go to. In fact, I got cameras on my house, and I use that all the time. Computers are async, by the way, if you didn't know it. With synchronous, though, cameras are on all the time. This makes perfect sense in order to get all the cameras where you can see them. Next up, you have async. This is where it only is going to use the time slots that if you need to put something in there, you can. If no one is online, you pretty much have control of the whole bandwidth at that point, and everything will go extremely fast. But if somebody else is using it, yeah, you might have some lag. But let's take a look at your dorm. Boingo, it uses async, but the problem you guys have is during the late afternoon and night, it's hard as heck to get on it, isn't it? But you could probably get on it in the morning because no one is on it. Get the point? The more people that get on it, the more time it's going to take for you to be able to put your information in there. It's efficient, but not for the masses in this case, because you have, what, at any given moment, a couple thousand in that general area. Well, multiplexer is going to have some problems, especially if you're trying to run a couple Netflix movies, Hulu movies, you want to play a game. Well, all of a sudden that bandwidth gets pretty big. So people are having to wait their time to send their information. So this gives you an idea how things work. You can see frame 1, we're going to use the max time. Frame 2, we can get just a little bit faster to get to frame 3. Frame 3 is only using 2, so it's going to be really fast to get to frame 4. So you can see the least amount of people are using this, the faster it's going to get for you. Problem with async, you got a lot of data that goes with it. You got stop and start bits because you got to tell the word, because there's really, when you get shoved to the front of the line because there's no one else there, then you still have to use a frame bit. You still have to use a stop and start bit to figure out where it needs to go in there. This one is when we do isochronous. You'll notice it says when we go from frame 1, and if you looked at let's go back here, you can see frame 1 has A, B, C, D for the channels. Frame 2 has A, B, D. Frame 3 is A, D, and frame 4 is A. When you get to here, which is isochronous, you'll see that the frame 1 has all of it taken up. So we're good. Now this is under the isochronous stage. Because you need to have everything on time. There is no, okay, speed it up to go to the next box that has some information in it. This one is going to stop and say, you need to stuff this with non-information bits just to keep it on time. Next up, anything that you multiplex, you should be able to demultiplex. And the idea is by sending all that information, especially the framing bit, you'll be able to determine where each one goes into each user/channel. Next up, we have signaling formats. So I have 10 o'clock. Let's take 5 minutes and take a quick break. Go to the bathroom, do whatever what you need to do. And we're going to cover signaling formats when I get back. So I got 10:01, be back at 10:06. You can let someone know. Bullshit. O'Donnell, are you there? How many tanks have you aced? Oh, okay. Well, you're doing a lot better than I did. It took me almost a year before I got my first one. All right. Let's go down the list here and make sure we got everybody. Mercer? Pareto? I'll get it right one of these days. I apologize. It's going to take me some time. Can you restate your name there so I know? Prieto. You got Ritzno and Rodriguez. Rodriguez. Okay. Mina. Here. Okay. Mitchell. Uh-oh. He's in the bathroom? Okay. So I take it both of you guys are roommates? No? How do you know he's in the bathroom? Okay. Why is he in CQ? Okay. Why did you go to CQ? Is it any of my business? Let's go that way. Okay. All right. I'll leave it alone. Raina? Okay. Salem? Salem. Schaefer? Schaefer? Okay. Salem? Oh, your headphones died. That's not good. Take it to speakers now? Okay. Maybe you need to replace your batteries or Bluetooth, I take it? Charge them up? Okay. Salem? Now notice that Jay has his headphones and his mic off. Okay, good, you're here. Jay? Airman Jay. Anybody know where the whereabouts of Airman J is? Okay. Yeah, I've done that a couple times on Discord. Now it's keyed up. Okay. And Mitchell, are you back yet? And the reason I do this is because the last thing I want to do is these signal formats, you're having difficulties understanding them, now's the time to do it. If you miss it, I don't want to have to repeat myself. That's the bad part. So, Mitchell, you back yet? I sure can, Schaefer. Okay, that's a good thing. Mitchell? All right, we're just going to have to continue on. All right, so let's take a look at... Oh, okay, you're back. Yeah, Mina was nice enough to tell us. So if you're going to be something like that, indisposed, make sure you tell someone. Also, this is the most difficult part. Well, I shouldn't say most difficult. It is difficult to understand. Most of our equipment has a direct relationship to the signaling formats. When you get to the NSM, you're going to see it. So the biggest thing is you're good, Mitchell. Just letting you know ahead of time. Hey, if you're going to be like that, just let people know if you can, please. Or just leave it in the chat. Hey, I gotta go to the bathroom. I don't know how long I'm going to be. So I would rather you guys be here when I'm going over something that is, in this case, it is a little complicated. So let's get right to it. Signaling formats. You're going to see this in the NSM, which you're going to be working on tomorrow. Again, I need somebody to send me all of your lab schedules so I know how to work things as far as the homework and appraisals and everything else that... Okay. Oh, okay, good. Now I see it. I had to go up a little bit farther. Thank you, Aaron Mercer. Appreciate it. All right, let's get right to it. NRZ, RZ, and CDI. You'll notice that these names will play an important part in how the signal is going to go down. So I always like to start with this one. How do you read this number? Left to right, right to left. So let's start with Airman J. How do you read it? Don't be afraid. Okay, Schaefer. How about you, Salem? Okay, he's left to right. How about you, Mitchell? Okay. Keep going down the list. Mina? Okay. Left to right, left to right. Seems to be a trend here. Got Rodriguez. Rich Snow. Prieto. O'Donnell. And Mercer. The reason why I ask you this is we as the populace always like to read our words from left to right. It's natural. You grew up reading that way. Well, with numbers, it's a little bit different. In order for you to figure out what it was, you actually had to go all the way to the right and read it from right to left. When we talk numbers, when we talk signals, when we talk anything else that's out there with the RF wonderful world, realistically, it's right to left. If you were to take a look at the oscopes, you will notice that it always likes to track from right to left. When you look at the distortion analyzers, not distortion analyzer, I'll think of it in a minute. I'll think of it. Come on, come on. Spec annies, there we go. That is the only one I have seen where it tracks from left to right. Kind of strange, but it happens. So today when we look at this, you're going to notice that most of our signals are going to start from the right and work our way left. All of our words for digital should start from right to left. Why? Because that's the way the numbers pan out. Now there's a couple places in our setups here. When we pull a slide down or a picture down, sometimes we don't get it the way it should be. So you'll see it from left to right. But I just wanted to point it out because I see a lot of problems with that. So let's take a look at an 8-bit word. This is how an 8-bit word is going to work. We go from right to left. All of our clock signals are going to go from right to left. Now, when you went through Dolan Hall, everybody was probably doing it from left to right because they didn't get out of that sequence of, okay, realistically, this is the way it's supposed to happen. When you get out in the field, you're going to notice that most of your equipment is going to track from right to left because it's a number system. So let's take a look at all these signaling formats and how we look at them. One of the things that you're going to see is NRZ. That means halfway through the clock cycle, words up and then back down, just like you would a sine wave. This is not going to go back to 0 when we put the data in it. Now, what happens with this? Well, when you look at what is given to you, you're going to have a clock cycle, and then you're going to have data, and then it's going to formulate the actual signal to send to the distant end. NRZ, look at this first sentence. It is the most common format within a multiplexer. What does that mean? Well, let's just say that you got 24 channels on a multiplexer. 24 plus users. Every one of those users could be a different signaling format. When it arrives at the multiplexer is going to, one, change that data into NRZ regardless of what the signal format was, change it into NRZ so it can sync things up. So it can tell, okay, this user had this signal, here, this is how I'm going to sync it up. The idea behind it is the multiplexer senses that and is able to build the aggregate using NRZ. When it gets ready to send it to the distant end, that's when it changes it maybe to CDI or it keeps it at NRZ. Most of the signaling formats that I have come in contact with my Air Force career is mainly NRZ or CDI when I'm sending it out of the multiplexer. When it comes into, it could be anything, but internally it's NRZ. Again, this namesake plays a very important part in how we look at the signal data. There are two different types. We have neutral and polar. Let's take a look at them. Neutral is a 5-volt difference between ones and zeros. 1 being +5, a 0 being 1. You'll notice that last sentence, it says requires a separate clock to stay in sync. You know, bye. No. You guys aren't very good with puns, are you? Yeah. Trying to get you guys interested. Anyway, I'm failing miserably. So with this, you got to send an extra signal along with the signaling format. You'll notice that last 3 sets of word there, not self-clocking. When it says not self-clocking, that means not only do you have to send the signaling format, but you have to send the clock cycle along with it. Here's what it looks like. So starting from right to left, you'll see that we've got a clock cycle. Below it is the data that we need to transfer into that signaling format. And then below it is the actual NRZ neutral waveform. So you can see at the first, starting from the right to the left, the 0 coming in. We are going to have it stay at 0. At no time during the clock cycle does it change. You see the next piece of data where it says 1. It's going to stay a 1 even though halfway through the clock cycle it doesn't change. Here comes another 1 data. It stays high and it doesn't change. We look at 0, then it goes to 0. Well, it's got no place to go, so it stays 0. We got 3 zeros in a row there, and then we get to a 1 and we change, so forth and so on. So you can see the changes when the data hits. Each clock cycle is that sequence of events in there. This is a reason why we need to send a clock cycle along with the signal. We have something called NRZ polar. This one's a little bit different. The first one, neutral, when you start running into long cables, as you well know, that there's going to be a voltage drop as it gets further out. So in other words, you could probably see from 0 to 5, let's say at a 500-foot cable, when you get to, let's just say, 600 feet, now you see 0 to 4, 700 is 0 to 3. Pretty soon the computer is not going to figure out, well, is that a 1 or a 0? I don't know yet. So with polar, it's a little bit easier to send it longer distances because of the differences between the +5 and -5. That's a 10-volt difference versus a 5-volt. Again, it's still not self-clocking. It just, you got to send another clock cycle with it in order to keep it synced up. So let's take a look at these. Here's your clock cycle starting from right to left, your data coming in, and then the actual signal being built. So the first data is 0. It's going to go to a -5. Why? Let's go back to the earlier section here where it says a +5 is 1s and 0s are -5. So you can see 0 goes all the way down to a -5. A 1 is a +5. We have 2 1s in a row, so it doesn't change anywhere on that clock cycle. We get 3 zeros in a row, it goes back down to -5, and so forth and so on. The difference between the polar and the neutral is that 5-volt difference between the two. 10 volts versus 5. Okay. Oh, Mina? Okay. Why in the world did you get called to CQ? Jeez. It's fine. I didn't even see the chat. Okay. Why in the heck did you get a new airman? I take it you're as a roommate? Okay. Count to 10. I understand, but you're supposed to be in the class. That's the only time that you would be. I mean, I understand that you got to do airman leader stuff, but after class, I don't understand. I guess they think that you're not doing anything and that you could go down there. So I'm going to try to emphasize through our IS is that you should not be going down when you're called. Dang. Did you miss anything? That's the big thing. How much did you miss? Okay. So again, you have, I'm going to try to get this up and operational, let's say probably in the afternoon. Oh, wait. I'll do my best to get this video back up, so if you miss something, you can still go over it. You'll have that reference to you. All right, so let's start here when we look at return to zero. Now, this one is going to return to zero halfway through the clock cycle, and you're going to see this a lot. There are 4 different types of RZ0, or excuse me, there is 4 different types of return to zero: RZ neutral, polar, bipolar, and bipolar with zero suppression. Let's take a look at this. Neutral, this is the 5-volt difference. It is not self-clocking, but there is going to be a little bit of a difference, hence the namesake. I'm going to return to zero halfway through the clock cycle. The problem is all ones are going to go back down to zero, but zeros are going to be the same, zero. So let's take a look at this. Here's your clock cycle. Zero stays zero regardless. The ones, we start to see the uptick of what happens halfway through the clock cycle. So with the data 1 halfway through the clock cycle, it's going to go click down. And likewise with the next data of 1. We get 2 zeros, then we get another data of 1, a 0, and a 1, and so forth and so on. Now with these, again, it's halfway through the clock cycle, but there's no way to figure out if this is on time. When we look at RZ polar, though, this is when we start seeing the self-clocking where I don't need to send a clock cycle to the distant end along with the signaling format. The nice thing is you got zeros are -5 and +5 are 1s. So let's take a look at this. Notice something happens every time that there is a clock cycle, and halfway through the clock cycle goes back to 0. So when we got 0, it's going to go to -5. Halfway through the clock cycle, it's going to pop up to 0. Hence the word return to 0. This is a self-clocking form of a signaling format. And you can see with the 2 1s, they're at +5. Halfway through the clock cycle, they go down. And of course, every 0, something is happening halfway through the clock cycle. This is the reason why they call it self-clocking. So what does that mean? It means I can send the signal and not have to add the clock to it. We have bipolar. Now this one is going to work similar to the polar, except for only on the ones. The ones are going to alternate between a +5 and a -5. Zeros are going to be 0. It is not self-clocking. We'll talk about the zero suppression here in just a minute. So this is the word or the namesake bipolar. Every time you see a logic of 1 from the data, we're going to flip-flop between a -5 and a +5. You notice we're going to start from the right to the left, and the reason why we're going to go in the positive side for our ones to start with is that's normally how everything works out. We always go to the positive. I've not seen any type of display where we go from the 0 down to the -1. Even though it's possible, I've just not seen it. Now, when we see the ones, they're going to alternate between the +5 and a -5. Again, something's happened halfway through the clock cycle, but when you throw a bunch of zeros in there, it throws it off time. So you need to send a clock cycle as it goes down. So the data is represented by the signaling format, and the clock is going to go along with it. So it's extra information. Overhead, in other words. Here's this bipolar with zero suppression. Again, it's bipolar, flip-flopping, but there is a additive to it. called a bit violation. This bit violation is going to let the dissonant, hey, there was X amount of zeros in a row. Now I got to worry about it. And you're going to see this in the NSM tech order, but it's the namesake you might see, kind of, but it's also called something alternate mark inversion. Alpha Mike India. Alternate mark inversion. It also has when you need to throw the zeros, and I'm pulling up my handy dandy cheat sheet. One is Bravo 8 Zulu Sierra, that's the North American. What that means is after the 8th zero, the 9th bit violation is going to happen. We got Hotel Delta Bravo 3, which is European or Japanese. This is where it's also going to throw it at the, instead of the third, in other words, you got 3 zeros, the 4th zero is going to throw a bit violation. And there's much more along with it. We'll get it in just a minute. Again, the word alternate mark inversion means it's bipolar. Always associated with the word RZ. So let's take a look at what's happening with our zero suppression. In this case, we're going to start just like the regular bipolar we saw earlier. We get a 0 in, it's going to stay 0. We get a 1 in, it's going to go to the high. We get another 1, it's going to flip-flop. This is where that H Hotel Delta Bravo 3. This would be an indication that after the third zero, if there is a 4th zero, we're going to throw a bit violation. Notice, it emulates the last data of 1. That right there is considered a bit violation. Why? If it was another data of 1, it would go to the positive side. In this case, it looks back down to the dissonant and says, hey, in order for me to throw a bit violation, I got to look at the last piece of data and emulate it. So that's what a bit violation is. You can program your multiplexer to accept these types where you don't need to send a clock cycle to the dissonant. Again, RZ bipolar with zero suppression is self-clocking. RZ polar is self-clocking. Again, with the bipolar zero suppression, you got to tell the dissonant what to do. Next up, we have something called CDI. Now, CDI is so much more different than our other signaling formats for one reason and one reason only. It's called transitions. They don't rely on the +5 and the 0 to dictate what is the format. It worries about the transitions. So we look at the data and determine how many transitions is going to happen within that clock cycle. If we got a 1, data of 1, we only need to do 1 transition. You'll notice it says out of phase with the clock during some clock cycles. That could happen, yes. With zeros, they're going to be in phase and there's going to be 2 transitions. So logic's 1 transition. Logic 0, 2 transitions. CDI is self-clocking. So we have 3, count them 3 self-clocking modes here. Let's take a look at it. So with a digital information of 0, you're going to have 2 transitions. They're going to be on the clock cycle. So in our case, it's going to go up. Halfway through the clock cycle, we're going to go down. There's your 2 transitions. With a data of 1, it can happen anywhere in that clock cycle. In our case, we're going to do it on the leading edge. And then when we get to another one, we're going to go down. So it doesn't rely on that +5 or 0 in order to switch. So this is the reason why it is self-clocking. So when you see a 0, it clocks itself. Hey, here's up and down. This is what the clock cycle remembers. anytime there's a data of 1, it could change somewhere in that clock cycle for its data. Self-clocking. All right, so is there any questions on signaling formats? If you do the signaling format worksheet and want me to look at it, I will look at it. I am more interested in you guys paying attention to how these signals are put into play and determining what is self-clocking and what is not self-clocking. This is your time to ask. No? All right, let's continue on. Let's look at Nyquist's theorem. Now, Dr. Nyquist, because that's who it is, developed this program, well, I should say theorem, where he looked at the voice and determined that most everybody's voices when we talk goes from about 300 to 3K, 32 to 34K. Just gives you an idea of where our human voice is. When I say 34K, I meant 3,400 hertz. I've seen some radios go as high as 3,600 hertz, but those are rare, in my opinion. So what he said is, you know what? Let's go from 0 to 4,000. That seems to be where we cover everybody's voice, because you have some that are very low on, for the low end, and some that are very high on the high end. Even though the human ear can hear somewhere in the 50, 60 hertz all the way up to about 18 to 20 K hertz. That's K, seriously. When you do your hearing check, they're checking for that to see if you got some issues. In electronics, you're going to find out that there is a very good possibility that if you're working around some high-pitched generating electronics, you could possibly run the risk of losing that part of a hearing. I worked around something called an OJ314, and it had an inverter on it in the maintenance room that if you stood in there for any length of time, man, your hearing was just ouch. It just gave me a headache every time I was in there. So it just goes to show you some electronics generate some high-pitched shrills. So with Dr. Nyquist, he came up with the formula: 2 times the highest audio frequency will give me samples per second. In our case, he said we're going to stop at 4,000 and take it times 2, which gives us 8,000 times a second. So that's 8,000 samples in 1 second. That's a lot. No, it's not. How many people have ever heard of the audio program Audacity? Okay. All right. So you have a couple different ways that you can save your work, either by what's called wave lossless. It's a wave file and it's lossless. Normally that's if you got a CD player or whatever, you can save it as that and it will play it. You can't save it as an MP3 and your CD player play it. I tried it. Won't work. But it also has a feature in there called PCM, pulse coded modulation. Accepting 8,000 times a second, it can go as high as 32K a second. That's a lot of processing power for that. So with pulse code modulation, you guys have actually went over it in block 2 with the PRIC 150. That's at analog to digital. We're going to go over it here. We're going to look at sampling, quantizing, and encoding. Those are the 3 steps that Dr. Nyquist said that we need to do. The first step, which is sampling, we're going to take that analog signal, we're going to divide it up in 8,000 samples per second, And depending on the waveform, we're going to capture using a what's called pulse amplitude modulated device in order to measure where that 8,000 times a second falls into. PAM meaning, this way, up and down. So we're looking at that signal, taking a sample of it at 8,000 times a second. We're going to go to step 2. We're going to take that and apply it to a chart. Now, everybody has probably seen a piece of graph paper. That's basically what this chart is. Everything is equal horizontally as well as vertically. This is what we call a uniform quantizing sheet. And we're going to take each one of those pulses and put it on that sheet with a figure. We have 127 lines to the positive and 127 lines to the negative. Okay. It says we got 256 steps. No, 255. I'll explain in just a minute. What we're going to do with each one of those pulses is we're going to put them on that graph paper and assign a number to it. There's 2 different types of tables we talk about. One is uniform and non-uniform. And there's a reason. With uniform quantizing, because of each one of them being equally spaced, one of those pulses may fall in between the lines, and that's a problem. This is what we call a quantization error. With that quantization error, it's got to take that number and either go up or down using the rounding configuration. Rounding being, hey, anything below 4 and below, I'm going to go down. Anything 5 and above, I'm going to round it in the up position. But it is basically non-representative of the signal and can cause problems like a distortion to a certain extent. Because the idea behind converting analog to digital is to save space. So when we send it to the distant end, it can demodulate it and get it back to an analog signal. Well, if it doesn't replicate the signal at the front end and all you have is a garbled mess, that's going to be a problem. How do we correct for those quantization errors? Well, they came up with an idea called non-uniform quantizing. And the idea behind it is we're going to start squashing most of those 127 lines closer to the middle because that's where the human voice normally is. And by doing so, when we formulated that pulse amplitude modulated pulse and put it on the graph paper, by closing those lines together, now we don't have as many quantization errors. You'll still get them, especially for people that have a low vibrato voice or a very high pitched voice, and it just happens. It's nature. So with that in mind, by creating these quantization errors from the uniform ones and transferring it over to the non-uniform one, that's when you start seeing more of a crystal clear audio on the distant end. When we finally apply all those numbers, we're going to make an 8-bit word. Now, let's go back to this 8-bit word. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. If you were to add these up, you do not get 256. You get up to 255. That's an error on our part. But you look at an 8-bit word. If you were to add 1 through 64, you would get 127. Okay, well that would explain the 127 numbers that we get, but what about the difference between negative and positive? I said an 8-bit word, well we're missing 128. Let's go take a look. When we convert the 8-bit word, the 8th digit is either a positive or a negative. Okay? Negative 127, positive 127. How does it work that? Okay. Well, if you take a look at this chart going from right to left, you will see that anything that's a negative will be a logic of 1. Anything that's a positive is a logic of 0. That's how we determine where on the 127 steps where to place it, either on the upper end or on the lower end, where 0's in the middle. And you go, well, don't we count 0? Well, yeah, if everything's 0, it doesn't matter if the 8th bit is a 1 or a 0. So that's where that comes into play. A lot of people were asking about the 0. It's all zeros. So with this in mind, we've done 3 steps. First, we sampled it. Then we quantized it using non-uniform to correct for quantization errors. And then we encode it. We put a number on it. Now, with that in mind, this is how we do this in most of our radios nowadays. It's also how encryption works to a certain extent, by 1s and 0s. Now, we talked about a little bit about Audacity and went from 8,000 samples to 3,200K. That's a significant difference. What does that have anything to do with it? Au contraire, the more you sample, the better the quality of that reproduction is. But the problem is with radios, do we need 3,200K to sampling? No, that would be a bigger processor to put in a radio, and it's not needed. So doing it voice only, that's all you need is 8K. So that's the reason why. The next up, we have something called frame period. This definition, the time it takes for one frame to occur. So what is a frame, first of all? Well, when you take a look at the frame, in our case, it's going to be 24 channels because that's how the standard came into play just recently. 24 channels multiplexer. So going from channel 1 to 24, that's what's going to happen. So we're going to take that 8,000 frame periods in 1 second, and we're going to figure this out. How long it takes to sample all 24 channels at that. So what we do is we take the reciprocal of 8,000, which is 1 over 8,000. We come up with 0.000125 seconds, or in our case, if we transfer, it's 125 microseconds. That is a frame period. Time it takes for one of those frames to occur. With PMSP, which is pulse modulated sample period, we're going to take, here, remember now, frame period's pretty large. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at one channel and see how long it took to sample that. That's what it means by the time it takes to sample one channel in a given frame. So here's your frame, 125 microseconds, and now we're going to check that one channel, how long it took. Well, with 24, you're going to divide 24 into the microseconds, which is 125. And you're going to come up with 5.28 microseconds. That's how long it took for one channel. Now remember, now you got 24 channels. So each channel has 5.28 seconds to be sampled. To get, when you get 8,000 in there to be sampled, that's what it's going to take to sample it. So that's pretty doggone quick. So we've gone over general multiplexing terms, data relationships, types of multiplexing, modes of TDM, demultiplexing, signaling formats, analog to digital conversion. Is there any questions? Everybody mentally exhausted? Yeah, it's a lot of information. That's the reason why this block is so difficult, is if you don't get the information, how would we say, logically, because we built from the lowest end to the highest end. We've gone from timing agencies all the way up to how to figure out how to put analog to digital, because that's the way things are working nowadays. It's all about how you get things timed and the signaling formats to play your games. How well you're able to get online versus how well you're being able to get onto a cell phone. So all this plays into what you guys have, what you can physically do, and you can see on the surface. Now we're into the complex stuff, and we're only doing the basic parts. So you can imagine what it would be like if we really got complicated. So any questions? We'll probably go over them tomorrow as soon as I look at the timing later on today. So I know you guys want to go eat lunch. So at this point, we're going to stop our class for the day. Please come back at 1 o'clock.